Okay, colleagues, welcome back. Let's push forward. The next section, a very important idea from Marx, ideology. Ideology. I mentioned in my video about ideology in Marx that this was the part of Marx's theory that first drew me in, and that I found I had found most fascinating in Marx, most appealing, right? So let's read this. Let's hope this is going to be a good section. So, the account of ideology contained in Marx's writings is regularly portrayed as the crucial element of his intellectual legacy. I would agree. It has been identified among his most influential ideas by John Elster and acclaimed. By the way, John Elster may be another name that it's a good idea for us to keep in mind. Acclaimed as the most fertile part of his social political theory. Not least. These views on ideology are said to constitute Marx's claim to a place alongside Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud as the masters of suspicion. Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, and Darwin, maybe. Masters of suspicion. That is, authors whose work cast doubt on the transparency of our everyday understanding of both our own identity and the social world we inhabit. Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, yes, terribly important philosophers. For me personally, for precisely this reason, this is, again, the term coming from Paul Ricoeur, wonderful French social theorist. Given this enthusiastic reception, it can come as something of a surprise. Oh, should it be a surprise, right? Surprise is that surprise. Marx doesn't have a clear theory of ideology, as we're going to find out, of course, in a second. To discover how little Marx's writings actually contain about ideology, how little he wrote about ideology, about communism, about all this other stuff, and how wow, this is an interesting word. How opaque those infrequent and passing observations are on the topic. So Marx's theory of ideology is, again, it's more of a sketch, more of a nodding towards a particular idea. It's not really a full-fledged ideology. It's not really a full-fledged conception. Anyway, there are, of course, some famous quotations. That's the problem. With Marx, we have famous quotations. We don't really have a developed theory. With so many things. These are brilliant quotations. They contain brilliant insight, but not theory. So insight, not complete theory. And this is something important to keep in mind, and this is also a problem with interpreting Marx after Marx. Like the Soviet interpretations, for example, that try to make Marx into a systematic theorist, which actually he was not. Or at least not exactly. So especially quotations from the German ideology, manuscripts, again, unpublished manuscripts, the German ideology. The references there, again, German ideology published in the 1930s, I think. The references there to ideology as involving an inversion of our relation between individuals and their circumstances, perhaps analogous to the working of a camera obscura, right, an optical device which projected an image of its surroundings upside down, but preserving perspective onto a screen inside. So, these quotations often mesmerized commentators, but not always generated much genuine illumination. The point should not be exaggerated, but these striking images notwithstanding, there's no clear and sustained discussion of ideology in Marx's corpus, which is unfortunately true, and to be kept in mind. Many commentators maintain that the search... Again, I told you, colleagues, I think in our course, Marx is the most difficult theorist. And this is, one of the problems is that the topic that he's writing about, our contemporary capitalist world, is difficult, but partly because Marx never got to finish his theory. Did he need more years? 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? Who knows? Many commentators maintain that the search for a single model of ideology in his work has to be given up. Indeed, there is something of an arms race in the literature as commentators discover 2, 3, even 5 competing modes of ideology in Marx's writing. Ellen Wood. Say hi to Ellen Wood again. Most surprisingly, it seems that some license can be found in Marx's corpus for 3 very different ways of thinking about what ideology is. There's textual evidence of his variously utilizing a descriptive account of ideology, involving a broadly anthropological study of the beliefs and rituals characteristic of a certain group, a positive account of ideology, as a worldview, providing the members of a group with a sense of meaning and identity, and a critical account seeking to liberate individuals from certain false and misleading forms of understanding. And now we have a reference to another wonderful theorist, Raymond Goyce, a brilliant political philosopher from Cambridge. Right? And Goyce actually has an 8-lecture series available on YouTube where he talks about Marx extensively. It's an interesting, very interesting account of Marx. I highly recommend it. Maybe I should link to it somehow. Anyway, it is the last of these, the critical account, rather than either of the two non-critical accounts, which is central to his wider social and political theory. But this account is itself subject to some considerable interpretative disagreement. Marx's theory of ideology is usually portrayed as an element in what might be called Marx's sociology, as distinct from his philosophical anthropology, say, or his theory of history, although complexly related to the latter. Okay, I'm not sure I agree, but whatever. Let's continue. Ideology and stability. Marx does not view ideology as a feature of all societies. Does not view ideology as a feature of all societies. Very controversially, Marx believes that in communism there will be no ideology. And in particular, Marx suggests that it will not, it will not be a feature of a future communist society. Yes, exactly. However, ideology is portrayed as a feature of all class-divided societies, and not only of capitalist society, although many of Marx's commentators are concerned with capitalism. The theory of ideology appears to play a role in explaining the feature of class-divided societies, which might otherwise appear puzzling, namely that it is their stability, right? That despite being ridden with conflict, the societies appear stable. Absence of an overt and serious conflict between social classes. This stability is not permanent, but it can last for extended historical periods. This stability appears puzzling to Marx because class-divided societies are flawed in ways which not only frustrate human flourishing, but also work to the material advantage of the ruling minority. So frustrate human flourishing and work to the material advantage of the ruling minority. Why do the subordinate classes who form a majority tolerate these flaws when resistance and rebellion of various kinds might be in their objective interest? Maybe the most important question. Marx's account of the sources of social stability in class-divided societies appeals to both repressive and non-repressive mechanisms. Such societies might often involve the direct repression or the threat of it of one group by another. But Marx does not think that this is the whole story. This is not the whole story. So violence is not the whole story. There are also non-repressive sources of stability. And ideology is usually and plausibly considered one of these, maybe the most important one. Very roughly, Marx's account of ideology claims that the dominant social ideas in such societies are typically false or misleading in a fashion that works to the advantage of the economically dominant class. The dominant social ideas in such societies are typically false or misleading in a fashion that works to the advantage of the economically dominant class. Yes. We should note that ideology would seem to be a part and not the whole of Marx's account of non-repressive sources of stability. Other factors might include dull economic pressure, including the daily grind. Other factors might include, very interesting. Dull economic pressure, including the daily grind to have to earn a living, and therefore which doesn't allow individuals presumably to think critically or to organize. Doubts, justified or otherwise, about the feasibility of alternatives. Sensitivity to the possible costs of radical social change. And collective action problems of various kinds which face those who do want to rebel and resist. Very interesting, all of this, very interesting. Let's make a note of all these. Marx does not think individuals are permanently trapped within ideological modes of thinking. Ideology may have an initial hold, but it is not portrayed as impervious to reason and evidence, especially in circumstances where the objective conditions for social change obtain. So this is base plus superstructure. Base plus superstructure. If you have the objective conditions for social change, the base, then, again, we have to maintain our materialist leanings, right? Then, reason and evidence, so ideological superstructure, can be efficient or effective. But you need the basic prerequisites. In a vacuum, ideological critique will not work. You need to have the right social conditions, material conditions, if you want. Characteristics. For Marx, ideological beliefs are social in that they're widely shared. Indeed, so widely shared that for long periods they constitute the ruling or dominant ideas in a given class-divided society. And they are social in that they directly concern or indirectly impact upon the action guiding understanding of the self and society that individuals have, right? These action guiding understandings include dominant legal, political, but also religious and philosophical views within the particular class divided societies in periods of stability. First and foremost, we're talking about capitalism, of course. Not all false or misleading ideas, beliefs count as ideological. So not everything that's false is ideology. Honest scientific error, for example, can be non-ideological. And ideological belief can be misleading without being strictly false. Ideological belief can be misleading without being strictly false. For example, defenders of capitalist economy portray what Marx calls the wage form with its exchange of equivalents as the whole rather than the part of the story. So it's a lie by omission. So it's like, it's not lie, but you are omitting important considerations. Indeed, the notion of falsity of ideology needs to be expanded beyond the content of the ideas in question to include cases where their origin are in some way contaminated. Okay, again, Goyce. Origins. The genetic account. Right, of ideology. Perhaps the only reason I believe something to be the case is that the belief in question has a consoling effect on me. Yeah, and let's compare this to Nietzsche. You believe something not because it is true, but you believe something because it makes you feel good. Wishful thinking. Arguably, such a belief is held ideologically, even if it happens to be true. Ideology, even if it happens to be true. Nevertheless, paradigmatic examples of ideology have a false content. For example, ideology often portrays institutions, policies, and decisions which are in the interest of the economically dominant class as being in the interest of society as a whole. Yes, portray the interest of the ruling class as the interest of all. This is one of the key hallmarks of ideology. And ideology often portrays social and political arrangements which are contingent or historical or artificial as being necessary, universal, or natural. So you portray something which is contingent, historical, or artificial as being necessary, universal, or natural. These are all wonderful words. I hope we're taking note of them. In addition to false or misleading content, ideological beliefs typically have at least two additional characteristics relating to their social origin and their class function. By social origin of ideology is meant, so again, social origin and class function. By the social origin of ideology is meant that Marx thinks these ideas are often originating with or being reinforced by the complex structure of class-divided societies, complex structure in which a deceptive surface appearance is governed by underlying essential relations. Capitalism is seen as especially deceptive in appearance. For example, Marx often contrasts the relative transparency of exploitation under feudalism, the relative transparency of exploitation under feudalism, important idea, transparency of feudalism, with the way in which the wage form obscures the ratio of necessary and surplus labor in capitalist societies. Yeah. So, feudalism is transparent in a way capitalism is not. So we talked about this in one of the lectures. Ideology stems in part from this deceptive surface appearance, which makes it difficult to grasp the underlying social flaws that benefit the economically dominant class. Difficult to grasp the underlying, difficult to see, difficult to measure the underlying social flaws that benefit the economically dominant class. Marx portrays the striving to uncover the essences concealed by misleading appearances as characteristic of scientific endeavor. So Marxism is scientific Marxism, I guess. And in this context, he distinguishes between classical political economy, which strove, albeit not always successfully, to uncover the essential relations often concealed behind misleading appearances, and what he calls vulgar economy. That's interesting. Which happily restricts itself to the misleading appearances themselves. Okay, maybe. Probably less important for our purposes. By class function of ideology is meant what Marx holds, that the pervasiveness of ideology is explained by the fact that it helps stabilize the economic structure of society. So ideology has a function. So this is the genetic account and the structural account, right? The genetic account and the structural account. So rating, so genetic plus the structural. I talked about this in my video on ideology. like the two, sorry, not structural, but functional. So ideology has a certain genesis, a certain genealogy, if you want, and a certain function. So social origin, this is the genetic, and class function, this is the functional count. All sorts of ideas might get generated for all sorts of reasons, but the ones that tend to stick in class societies do so not because of the truth, but because they conceal or misinterpret or justify the flaws in society in ways which redound to the benefit of the economically dominant class. Wonderful, wonderful line. All sorts of ideas might get generated for all sorts of reasons. So functionalist account, say hi to Cohen. But the ideas that tend to stick, ideas that tend to become widely accepted, are accepted not because of their truth, but because they conceal or misrepresent or justify the flaws in that society in ways which redound to the benefit of the economically dominant class. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Wolff. Is this Robert Paul Wolff? Probably Robert Paul Wolff. I wonder. In response, critics often see this as just another example of sloppy functional reasoning, blah, blah, blah. No, I disagree. Read Darwin. This is not sloppy, this is not functional. Read Darwin. Okay? And understand Darwin. Okay? Functionalist explanation is real explanation. You just need to understand how it works. It's not teleological. In the present case, it is said that Marx never properly explained, blah, blah, blah. I am unsympathetic to these criticisms. Yet there are obvious plausible mechanisms here. Yes, there are plausible mechanisms here. To give two examples. First, there is control of the ruling class over the means of mental production, and in particular, the print and broadcast media. Think about this. Is this relevant in 2020? Which in capitalist society are typically owned and controlled by the wealthy. Yes. Very important. Very important. So the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class because the rulers have the control over the spread of ideas through controlling the printing presses, controlling the broadcasts, etc., etc. YouTube takedowns, that kind of thing, maybe. Second possible mechanism that appeals to psychological need of individuals for invented narratives that legitimize or justify social position. Talk about this a little bit. Again, Jamie Edwards, I think, right, talks about this in the video on ideology, which I've posted about a week ago. Marx identifies a widespread need in flawed societies for the consolatory effects of religion. Notice, opium is taken voluntarily. Opium is taken voluntarily. Religion is the opium. And that's it. Moving fast. Next section. Going to be a very important section about the state. But for now, let's pause. Okay. This section I like. This section I approve. Wonderful. Okay, colleagues. Take care. I'll see you round. And that's it. Moving fast. Next section. Going to be a very important section about the state. But for now, let's pause. Okay. This section I like. This section I approve. Wonderful. Okay, colleagues. Take care. I'll see you round.